Rain pounded against the windshield of Arthur's battered truck when his high beams caught her. A woman in a shredded, mud-soaked Vera Wang wedding gown, sprinting barefoot down a desolate stretch of Route 27. She wasn't just a runaway bride. She was Victoria Kensington, the ruthless CEO of Kensington Enterprises, running from a multi-billion-dollar corporate merger disguised as a high-society marriage. Giving her a ride was Arthur's first mistake as a single father trying to survive. Falling for her would become his deadliest. The wipers of Arthur Dawson's 2011 Ford F-150 squeaked in a rhythm that matched the pounding headache behind his eyes. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the torrential downpour over Long Island showed no signs of stopping. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, his calloused hands stained with motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. He had just pulled a 14-hour shift at the garage in Southampton, trying to scrape together enough overtime to cover his 7-year-old daughter's upcoming dental surgery. Life had been a relentless uphill battle since his wife passed away 3 years ago, leaving him drowning in hospital bills and entirely alone to raise little Chloe. The Montauk Highway was a black ribbon stretching into the abyss, flanked by thick, ancient trees that bowed under the heavy coastal winds. The wealthy summer residents had long since abandoned the Hamptons for their penthouses in Manhattan, leaving the roads desolate and eerie. Arthur leaned forward, squinting through the smeared glass. Then, a flash of white cut through the darkness. Arthur slammed on the brakes. The heavy truck hydroplaned for a terrifying second, the anti-lock brakes stuttering violently before the vehicle skidded to a halt just feet away from a figure standing in the middle of the road. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. Through the blinding glare of his halogen headlights, he saw her. She looked like a ghost, violently dragged back into the mortal world. The woman was drenched to the bone, her dark hair plastered across her face in chaotic streaks. But it was her clothes that made Arthur question his sanity. She was wearing a wedding dress, or what was left of one. The intricately beaded bodice was intact, but the voluminous silk skirt had been torn up to the knees, the expensive fabric shredded and coated in thick, dark mud. In her right hand, dangling by their delicate ankle straps, were a pair of ruined, crystal-encrusted Jimmy Choo heels. For a second, neither of them moved. The rain lashed against the hood of the truck. Then, the woman stumbled forward, her bare, bruised feet slapping against the asphalt. She didn't hesitate. She marched straight to the passenger side and yanked the heavy door open, hauling herself into the cab with a desperate burst of adrenaline. "Drive!" she gasped, her voice trembling but lined with a sharp, unmistakable authority. Arthur stared at her, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. Up close, despite the smeared mascara and the dirt smudged across her cheekbones, he could see the aggressive, sharp angles of her face. She wasn't just beautiful. She possessed the kind of expensive, intimidating aura that demanded compliance. Around her neck sat a diamond collar so massive it caught the dim dashboard light and threw fractured rainbows across the truck's worn interior. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but I should call the police," Arthur said, instinctively reaching for his battered smartphone in the cup holder. Before his fingers could graze the screen, her cold, wet hand clamped over his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "No police!" she commanded, her green eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. If you call the police, they will ping the dispatch. He has people on the payroll in Suffolk County. If you make that call, he will know exactly where I am in 3 minutes." "Who is he?" Arthur demanded, pulling his arm back. "Look, I'm just a mechanic trying to get home to my kid. I don't need whatever kind of trouble you're running from." "I have money," she said quickly, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She dropped the muddy designer heels onto the rubber floor mats and reached behind her neck. With a swift, aggressive motion, she unclasped the heavy diamond necklace and tossed it directly into Arthur's lap. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. That is a custom Cartier piece. It's insured for $2.4 million. Keep it. Sell it. Throw it in the ocean. Just get me out of this zip code right now, or I swear to God, the men chasing me will not care that you were just an innocent bystander. Arthur stared at the jewelry in his lap, then back at the rearview mirror. Far down the dark highway, a pair of intensely bright LED headlights had just rounded the curve. They were moving dangerously fast, cutting through the storm with predatory purpose. A heavy knot formed in Arthur's stomach. His survival instincts, honed by years of scraping by, were screaming at him to kick her out. But as he looked at the sheer terror vibrating beneath the woman's cold, commanding facade, the memory of his late wife's vulnerability flashed in his mind. He couldn't leave someone on the side of the road to be hunted. "Put your seatbelt on," Arthur growled. He threw the truck into drive, slamming his work boots onto the gas pedal. The old V8 engine roared in protest, the tires spinning on the wet asphalt before catching traction, as the F-150 surged forward, plunging them back into the stormy darkness. Arthur glanced at the rear-view mirror again. The headlights behind them were accelerating, but Arthur knew the back roads of Long Island better than any high-paid mercenary in a luxury SUV. He killed his own headlights, relying only on the faint glow of the moon piercing through the storm clouds, and sharply yanked the steering wheel to the right, plunging the truck down an unpaved, hidden logging trail. The branches whipped against the windshield as they vanished into the dense woods, leaving the pursuing vehicle to speed blindly past them on the main highway. In the sudden, tense silence of the hidden trail, the woman slumped back against the cracked leather seat, closing her eyes. "Who are you?" Arthur asked quietly. She opened her eyes, turning her head to look at him. "My name is Victoria Kensington, and by tomorrow morning, I will be the most wanted woman in America." The drive to Arthur's small single-story house in Patchogue was suffocatingly quiet. Victoria Kensington had remained silent, her arms wrapped tightly around her shivering frame, staring out the window as the opulent estates of the Hamptons gave way to the modest, tightly packed neighborhoods of working-class Long Island. Arthur kept to the back streets, his eyes constantly darting to the mirrors, paranoid that every pair of headlights belonged to whoever she was running from. When he finally pulled into his narrow driveway, parking the truck behind a set of overgrown hedges to shield it from the street, he killed the engine and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. "It's not the Ritz," Arthur muttered, grabbing his keys, "but it's safe. For tonight, at least." Victoria looked at the weathered siding of the house, the chipped paint on the porch, and the small, rusted tricycle abandoned on the front lawn. To a woman whose family name was plastered on high-rises in Manhattan, it must have looked like a shack. But to her credit, she didn't say a word. She just followed him through the freezing rain and into the house. The interior was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and old books. The furniture was worn but clean, and the walls were plastered with crayon drawings of unevenly shaped animals. "Wait here," Arthur whispered, taking off his wet jacket. He walked softly down the narrow hall and peeked into the bedroom. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, was dozing in the armchair in the corner. In the bed, little Chloe was fast asleep, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Arthur gently tapped Mrs. Gable on the shoulder, paid her the $40 he owed her for the extended babysitting, and quietly ushered her out the back door so she wouldn't see the muddy bride standing in his living room. When Arthur returned, Victoria was standing awkwardly in the center of the room. She was dripping water onto his faded rug, looking entirely out of place, like a swan that had crash-landed in a dive bar. "I need a towel," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, an ingrained habit of someone used to giving orders. Arthur grabbed a clean towel and an oversized gray sweatshirt from the hall closet and tossed them to her. "Bathroom is down the hall to the left. Take that dress off before you catch pneumonia. And keep your voice down. My daughter is sleeping." 10 minutes later, Victoria emerged. She had managed to scrub the mud from her legs and face, though her dark hair was still damp. She was swimming in Arthur's oversized sweatshirt, which hung down to her mid-thigh, a stark contrast to the millions of dollars of ruined haute couture she had discarded in his bathtub. Without the armor of her wedding dress and makeup, she looked younger, exhausted, and incredibly vulnerable. She sat down at the small kitchen table, wrapping her hands around the steaming mug of black coffee Arthur placed in front of her. "So," Arthur said, taking a seat across from her. "Victoria Kensington, as in Kensington Global, the real estate firm that just bought half of Midtown." "The very same," Victoria said dryly, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. She didn't complain about the taste. "And the man I left standing at the altar tonight at the Oheka Castle was Conrad Van Der Berg." Arthur let out a low whistle. "The hedge fund billionaire. That's a hell of a power couple. Why run? Why not just call it off before you put on the dress?" Victoria's eyes darkened, a flash of pure venom breaking through her exhaustion. "Because it wasn't a marriage, Arthur. It was a hostile takeover. My father passed away 6 months ago, leaving me the controlling shares of the company. Conrad has been quietly buying up the board of directors. 3 days ago, I found out he set up a network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't marrying me to merge our empires. He was marrying me to gain legal access to my father's offshore trusts so he could liquidate the entire company and sell off the assets to a private equity firm in Dubai." Arthur frowned. "So you tell the board. You go to the SEC. Conrad is always 10 steps ahead," Victoria whispered, her voice dropping. "He found out I knew. Yesterday, he cornered me in my office. He showed me heavily doctored, but incredibly convincing documents implicating my late father in a massive wire fraud and embezzlement scheme. If I didn't say I do tonight, he promised to leak the documents to the federal authorities. It would destroy my father's legacy, ruin my family's name, and I would likely face 20 years in federal prison." Arthur stared at her, the reality of the danger she had brought into his home settling like a stone in his gut. This wasn't a romantic comedy about a bride getting cold feet. This was high-stakes corporate warfare, and the people involved played for keeps. "I needed time," Victoria continued, rubbing her temples. "If I married him tonight, the transfers would begin tomorrow morning. But if I ran, if I vanished, the trusts remain locked in a probationary freeze. I just need 48 hours to contact my private investigators in London. They are tracking down the real Cayman accounts to prove Conrad's extortion. But Conrad knows this. That's why his security team was right behind me. He can't afford to let me make a phone call." Arthur suddenly remembered the $2.4 million Cartier necklace sitting on his kitchen counter. He looked at it, then looked at Victoria. A sickening realization hit him. "Victoria," Arthur said slowly, "a man like Conrad, a man who blackmails his fiancé and controls a private security army. He wouldn't just give you a multi-million-dollar heirloom on your wedding day without insurance, would he?" Victoria frowned, confused by the sudden change in Arthur's tone. "Insurance? The necklace is a family piece, She stopped. Her green eyes widened in absolute horror as she looked at the heavy diamond piece on the counter. "The clasp," she choked out. "It was unusually thick. He insisted on putting it on me himself before the reception." Arthur lunged for the necklace. He didn't bother looking for a microscopic seam. He grabbed a heavy steel wrench from his kitchen toolbox and brought it down hard on the thick platinum clasp. The metal shattered. Nestled inside the broken platinum casing was a tiny, flashing red LED light, a micro GPS tracker. Arthur's blood ran ice cold. He looked up at the front window, slowly, menacingly. A pair of black Mercedes G-wagons with heavily tinted windows rolled down his quiet, residential street. They stopped right at the edge of his driveway, their engines idling with a low, predatory hum. They had been found. The low, guttural purr of the twin Mercedes G-wagons vibrating through the rain-soaked street felt like a physical weight pressing against Arthur's chest. For 3 seconds, time entirely suspended itself. He stared through the gap in the living room curtains, watching as 4 men dressed in tactical black rain gear stepped out of the vehicles. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity that had nothing to do with standard private security and everything to do with paramilitary training. Victoria stepped up beside Arthur, her breath catching in her throat as she peered through the glass. Her face, already pale from exhaustion, drained of all remaining color. "They brought the fixer," she whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed a shaking finger at a tall, broad-shouldered man stepping out of the lead vehicle. Even in the dark, his shaved head and cold, methodical posture stood out. "His name is Desmond. He's Conrad's head of acquisitions." "Arthur, they aren't here to negotiate. They are here to make us disappear." The sheer gravity of her words snapped Arthur out of his paralysis. His survival instincts, buried deep beneath years of changing diapers and paying mortgages, roared back to life. He was a father first, and a dead man if he didn't move right now. "Get away from the window," Arthur ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. He grabbed the shattered platinum clasp and the blinking red micro-tracker from the kitchen counter. He sprinted into the bathroom, threw the tiny electronic device into the toilet, and slammed his hand down on the flush lever. It wasn't a permanent solution, but the tracker would travel through the neighborhood's underground sewage pipes, hopefully buying them a critical 5-minute head start while Desmond's men chased a signal moving beneath the asphalt. Arthur sprinted down the narrow hallway and threw open the door to his daughter's room. Chloe was still fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling beneath her faded pink comforter, clutching her worn-out stuffed rabbit. "Chloe, baby, wake up," Arthur whispered, shaking her gently. The 7-year-old stirred, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Daddy, is it morning?" "No, sweetie, but we have to play a game right now. The silent game. Do you remember the rules?" Chloe nodded groggily, trusting her father implicitly. Arthur didn't waste time looking for her shoes. He wrapped her entirely in the thick comforter, scooping her up into his arms. He turned to find Victoria standing in the doorway, her green eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming guilt as she looked at the sleeping child. "Out the back, now!" Arthur hissed, shoving past her. They moved silently through the kitchen, Arthur killing the lights as they went. He unbolted the heavy deadbolt on the back door and pushed it open. The storm was still raging outside, the wind howling through the branches of the old oak tree in the backyard. "My truck is blocked," Arthur muttered as they stepped off the back porch into the freezing mud. "And they probably already ran the plates. We need to take the ghost." "The ghost?" Victoria asked, shivering violently as the freezing rain soaked through the oversized sweatshirt. "Stay behind me and keep quiet," Arthur commanded. He led her across the flooded lawn, bypassing the driveway completely, heading toward the detached, corrugated metal garage sitting at the far edge of the property line, backing up into a dark, overgrown alleyway. Arthur punched a 4-digit code into the side keypad, hauling the heavy side door open. Inside the garage, under the harsh glow of a single, flickering fluorescent bulb, sat a pristine, midnight blue, 1998 Volvo V70 station wagon. It looked like the most boring, invisible suburban car ever manufactured. But as Arthur threw open the passenger door for Victoria and gently placed a bundled-up Chloe into the back seat, the true nature of the vehicle became apparent. Arthur had spent the last 2 years secretly rebuilding the wagon for an underground street racer in Queens. Underneath the faded, boxy exterior was a heavily modified, twin-turbocharged engine capable of pushing 600 horsepower, reinforced suspension, and a reinforced steel chassis. "Get in the floorboard," Arthur instructed Victoria as he jumped into the driver's seat. "Do not let them see your face through the windows." Victoria didn't argue. She scrambled into the passenger footwell, curling her knees to her chest, just as a tremendous, deafening crash echoed from the front of the property. Desmond's men had just kicked in the front door of Arthur's house. Arthur jammed the key into the ignition. The Volvo's engine didn't sputter. It roared to life with a deep, violent, guttural growl that shook the concrete floor. He hit the garage door opener, shifting the car into reverse. Before the metal door had even fully cleared the roof of the car, Arthur slammed the gas pedal. The heavy station wagon shot backward out of the garage, its wide tires spraying gravel and mud across the alleyway. Arthur threw the shifter into drive, spinning the steering wheel with one hand while holding Chloe's car seat securely with the other. The Volvo rocketed down the pitch-black alley, its headlights completely shut off, navigating strictly by memory and the faint flashes of lightning. Back at the house, tactical flashlights swept through the empty living room. Desmond stood over the shattered Cartier necklace on the kitchen counter, his radio buzzing. "Sir, the tracker signal is moving," a voice crackled over the earpiece. "It's heading south, moving at a steady pace beneath Elm Street." Desmond narrowed his cold, dead eyes, walking slowly into the bathroom. He looked at the swirling water in the toilet bowl. A cruel, dark smile twisted his lips. "Call off the tracking team," Desmond ordered into his radio. "They flushed it. Run the property records for this address. I want the owner's name, his family history, his bank records, and the license plate of every vehicle registered to this county. They are in a car, and they have a child. They won't get far." The rain pelted the windshield of the speeding Volvo, like a swarm of angry hornets, as Arthur merged onto the Southern State Parkway, heading west toward the boroughs of New York City. He kept the speedometer hovering exactly at the legal limit, blending in perfectly with the sparse, late-night commercial traffic. To any passing highway patrol cruiser, they were just another exhausted family driving through the storm. In the passenger side footwell, Victoria finally pulled herself up into the seat, her hands shaking as she buckled her seatbelt. She looked back at Chloe, who was sleeping peacefully, lulled by the heavy hum of the reinforced engine and the warmth of the car's heater. The silence between Arthur and the billionaire runaway was suffocating, thick with unspoken anger and dread. "I'm sorry," Victoria finally whispered, her voice cracking. It was a rare, perhaps unprecedented, admission of guilt from a woman who had spent her life commanding boardrooms. "I didn't know about the tracker. If I had known, I never would have gotten into your truck. I never would have brought this to your home." Arthur gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes remained locked on the slick, black highway ahead. "Sorry doesn't fix this, lady," Arthur growled, his voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "Those men kicked my front door in. They stood in the hallway where my daughter sleeps. Do you have any idea what people like that do to witnesses? My life, my kid's life, is completely ruined because you decided to play corporate espionage on your wedding day. I will compensate you." Victoria fired back, her defensive corporate instincts kicking in despite her guilt. "Once I reach my people in London, I will wire you $10 million. I will buy you a new house. I will relocate you anywhere in the world. I have the resources, Arthur. I just need to get to a secure, untraceable terminal to make contact." Arthur let out a bitter, hollow laugh. $10 million. Right. Because money solves everything in your world, doesn't it? Well, out here in the real world, Conrad's hitmen don't care about your offshore accounts. They care about tying up loose ends. And right now, Chloe and I are the biggest loose ends you have. Before Victoria could respond, a small, sleepy voice drifted from the back seat. "Daddy, why is the lady wearing your clothes?" Both adults froze. Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror to see Chloe sitting up, her big brown eyes blinking in confusion as she clutched her stuffed rabbit, looking directly at Victoria. Victoria stiffened. She had dealt with ruthless shareholders, hostile media, and predatory executives, but she had absolutely zero experience dealing with a 7-year-old child. She slowly turned around in her seat, forcing a stiff, awkward smile. "Hello," Victoria said cautiously. Chloe tilted her head, analyzing the beautiful, disheveled stranger. She noticed the expensive, sparkling diamond earrings still clinging to Victoria's earlobes, a sharp contrast to Arthur's faded gray sweatshirt. "Are you a princess?" Chloe asked innocently. "You have princess earrings, but you're very muddy." Victoria stared at the little girl, the innocent question cutting straight through her hardened, cynical armor. For a brief, startling second, the ruthless CEO vanished, leaving behind only a terrified woman running for her life. "No, sweetie," Victoria said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I'm not a princess. Sometimes I have to be the dragon just to survive." Chloe seemed to accept this answer with a solemn nod. "Dragons are cool. My dad is a knight. He fixes things." Arthur swallowed hard, the anger in his chest shifting into a heavy, painful, protective ache. "Go back to sleep. Chloe, we're going to visit Uncle Garrett." Victoria shot Arthur a questioning look. "Garrett Hayes," Arthur explained quietly, keeping his eyes on the road. "He was my squad leader in Afghanistan. Now he runs a scrap metal yard deep in Queens. He's paranoid, he hates the government, and his property is completely off the grid. If anyone has a secure, untraceable internet connection, it's him." 40 minutes later, the Volvo rattled down a deeply potholed industrial road in Willets Point, Queens. The area was a labyrinth of chop shops, towering piles of rusted car frames, and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Arthur pulled up to a heavy steel gate that looked like it belonged to a maximum security prison. He flashed his headlights twice, paused, and flashed them 3 times. A moment later, a massive, heavily bearded man in a yellow rain slicker stepped out from a corrugated tin guardhouse. He racked a pump-action shotgun, leveling it directly at the windshield until he recognized Arthur's face through the glass. Garrett lowered the weapon, a massive grin splitting his weathered face as he hit a button, dragging the heavy gate open. Arthur parked the Volvo inside a massive warehouse filled with stripped vehicle chassis. As they stepped out of the car, Garrett walked over, pulling Arthur into a crushing bear hug. "Artie, man, I haven't seen you since—" Garrett's voice died in his throat as his eyes landed on Victoria. He recognized her instantly, the color completely drained from the hardened veteran's face. "Garrett, we need help," Arthur said quickly. "We need a secure terminal. Right now." Garrett didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and marched toward a small, reinforced office in the corner of the warehouse. He booted up a massive, military-grade laptop on a greasy metal desk and rapidly typed in a sequence of commands. "You don't need a terminal to contact London, Artie," Garrett said, his voice deadly serious as a news broadcast buffered onto the screen. "You need a lawyer and a miracle." Arthur and Victoria crowded around the monitor. The screen flashed to a breaking news alert from CNN. There, plastered across the national broadcast, was a crystal-clear security photo of Arthur's face, pulled from a traffic camera near his house. Beneath it was a picture of Victoria in her wedding dress. The headline, running across the bottom of the screen, read, "Billionaire heiress, Victoria Kensington, abducted by deranged mechanic on wedding night. Groom Conrad Van Der Berg offers $5 million bounty for her safe return." Conrad hadn't just tracked them. He had weaponized the entire country against them. Arthur Dawson wasn't just a man on the run anymore. He was the most hunted man in America. The harsh fluorescent light of the garage flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the rusted car parts. On the laptop screen, the CNN broadcast looped the security footage of Arthur's truck speeding away from the Hamptons. The anchor's voice droned on, detailing the frantic, tearful press conference Conrad Van Der Berg had just given outside the Oheka Castle. Conrad looked the part of a devastated fiancé, perfectly, his voice breaking as he begged the deranged kidnapper to return his beloved Victoria, unharmed. Arthur felt the air completely leave his lungs. His legs gave out, and he slumped into a grease-stained rolling chair, burying his face in his calloused hands. $5 million, Garrett whispered, shaking his head slowly as he stared at the screen. "Artie, you have no idea what that number means. That kind of money doesn't just bring out the cops. It brings out the cartels, the organized syndicates, every bounty hunter from here to Chicago, and every desperate civilian with a smartphone. You are the highest value target in the country right now." Victoria stared at the image of her fiancé on the screen. The sheer audacity of Conrad's move left her momentarily stunned. But the shock quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp rage. This was how Conrad operated. He didn't just eliminate his enemies. He completely dismantled their reputations, turning the world against them so his hands appeared perfectly clean. By framing Arthur as a kidnapper, Conrad had given his private mercenaries, led by Desmond, absolute legal cover to shoot Arthur on sight under the guise of a rescue mission. And in the chaos of a firefight, Victoria would undoubtedly become tragic collateral damage. "I can't turn myself in," Arthur said, his voice hollow as he looked up at his daughter. Chloe was sitting on a stack of clean tires, happily feeding her stuffed rabbit an imaginary carrot, completely oblivious to the fact that her father's life was effectively over. "If I go to the police and tell them the truth, Conrad's people will kill me in a holding cell before I even see a judge. They'll make it look like a suicide. And Chloe, she'll go into the foster system." "You are not going to jail, Arthur," Victoria said firmly, stepping forward. The trembling, terrified bride from the highway was gone. In her place stood the ruthless CEO who had successfully navigated the shark-infested waters of global corporate takeovers. Her posture straightened, and her green eyes locked onto Arthur with fierce determination. Conrad played his hand. "Now it's my turn, but I need to get to Manhattan," Garrett scoffed, crossing his massive arms. "Manhattan? Lady, there are cameras on every toll booth, bridge, and tunnel going into the city. The NYPD has a dragnet out for this guy. You won't make it past Queens." "I don't have a choice," Victoria countered, matching Garrett's aggressive tone. "Before my father died, he suspected Conrad was skimming from our international accounts. My father was old school. He didn't trust digital servers or cloud storage. He kept physical ledgers, Hard copies of the original Cayman Island Trust documents, complete with Conrad's forged signatures and the routing numbers for his illegal offshore shells. Those ledgers are in a private vault at the Federal Depository on Fifth Avenue. If I can get those documents into the hands of my corporate attorney, Conrad goes to federal prison for extortion and fraud, and the kidnapping charges against Arthur evaporate instantly. Arthur rubbed his temples, his mind racing. How do we even get into a federal depository when we're the most wanted faces in America? The vault is registered under a shell corporation, Victoria explained rapidly. Conrad doesn't know about it. Access requires a physical key and a dual biometric scan, my fingerprint and a retinal scan. I just need to get through the front doors. Before Arthur could process the insane logistics of infiltrating a highly secure Manhattan bank, the heavy metal door to the garage's main office swung open. A teenager, no older than 19, stood in the doorway. It was Toby, Garrett's nighttime apprentice. He was wearing an oil-stained jumpsuit, and his hands were trembling violently. In his right hand, he clutched a smartphone, the screen glowing brightly with the same CNN broadcast they had just been watching. Toby looked from the phone screen to Arthur, then to Victoria, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming greed. "Toby," Garrett said slowly, holding his hands up in a calming gesture, carefully positioning his body between the kid and the shotgun resting on the desk. "Put the phone down, son. You don't know what's going on here." "I saw the alert," Toby stammered, backing away toward the heavy steel garage door. $5 million, boss. My mom is sick. We're losing the apartment. I just called the tip line. I had to. The cops are already on their way." Arthur's blood ran cold. The sanctuary had been breached. "You idiot!" Garrett roared, lunging forward. Toby shrieked and bolted through the office door, slamming it shut behind him and locking the deadbolt from the outside. The heavy clanking of the external security gate rolling down echoed through the warehouse. He was locking them in to wait for the police. "Grab the kid!" Arthur yelled to Victoria, pointing at Chloe. Victoria didn't hesitate. She scooped the 7-year-old up into her arms, pressing Chloe's face into her shoulder as the little girl began to cry from the sudden shouting. "Garrett, the back door!" Arthur shouted. "Welded shut!" Garrett yelled back, racking the shotgun. "We're in a steel box! Artie!" In the distance, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to cut through the stormy night. It wasn't just one siren, it was a chorus of them, converging on the Willets Point junkyard from every direction. Conrad's bounty had worked faster than they ever could have anticipated. "Get in the Volvo," Arthur commanded, his military training taking complete control. He sprinted to the driver's side, throwing the door open. Garrett hit the override on the main bay doors. "Toby cut the power line to the motor," Garrett shouted, pointing to the severed cables dangling near the control box. "The bay doors won't open." Arthur looked at the massive, corrugated steel doors blocking their only exit. He looked at the reinforced hood of the 1998 Volvo V70. He calculated the horsepower, the steel frame, and the sheer desperation of their reality. "Garrett, get in the back with Chloe," Arthur roared, dropping into the driver's seat and buckling his seatbelt. "Victoria, brace yourself." As the blue and red flashing lights of the first NYPD cruisers illuminated the frosted windows of the warehouse, Arthur stomped on the gas. The twin turbocharged engine of the heavily modified Volvo shrieked like a banshee as Arthur dropped the transmission into gear. He didn't have enough runway to build up maximum speed, but the 600 horsepower roaring under the hood didn't need much space to deliver devastating kinetic energy. "Keep your heads down!" Arthur bellowed over the deafening roar of the engine. In the back seat, "Get threw his massive body over Chloe, shielding the terrified child with his heavy rain slicker. Victoria braced her hands against the dashboard, her eyes squeezed shut as the heavy station wagon hurtled toward the massive corrugated steel doors of the garage. Crash. The impact was cataclysmic. The reinforced steel chassis of the Volvo hit the rolling bay doors with the force of a freight train. The metal buckled, shrieking as the hinges violently tore free from the concrete walls. The heavy doors blew outward into the alleyway, raining rusted shrapnel and sparking debris into the flooded street. The Volvo burst through the wreckage, its suspension bottoming out violently before the heavy tires caught traction on the wet asphalt. Right as they cleared the alley, 3 NYPD cruisers skidded around the corner, their sirens blaring, attempting to blockade the exit. Arthur didn't hit the brakes. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, drifting the heavy wagon through the narrow gap between a police cruiser and a rusted dumpster. The side mirror of the Volvo shattered against the cruiser's light bar, but they broke through the perimeter before the officers could even draw their weapons. "Hold on!" Arthur yelled, punching the accelerator. The station wagon rocketed down the industrial service roads, a midnight blue blur vanishing into the maze of Queens before the police could reorganize their pursuit. Arthur kept the headlights off, navigating strictly by the ambient glow of the streetlights and his intimate knowledge of the borough's blind spots. Within 10 minutes, he had seamlessly blended the car into the heavy flow of commercial delivery trucks heading toward the Midtown Tunnel. The silence inside the car was thick with adrenaline and heavy breathing. In the back, Chloe was crying softly, her tiny hands clutching Garrett's jacket. "It's okay, kiddo," Garrett murmured gently, completely out of his element but trying his best to soothe her. "Your dad's just showing off his driving skills. We're playing a real-life video game." Victoria looked over at Arthur. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like granite. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes darting endlessly between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. He was terrified, but he was holding it together. He was a protector. For a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by men who only cared about profit margins and power, watching Arthur risk everything to keep his daughter safe triggered an unfamiliar ache in her chest. "The Federal Depository opens at 7 a.m. for private clients," Victoria said quietly, checking the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 4:15 a.m. "We have less than 3 hours to get into Manhattan, ditch this car, and find a way inside before Conrad's mercenaries lock down the city." "We can't go through the tunnels or bridges," Arthur said grimly. "They'll have facial recognition cameras scanning every windshield, and this car is going to be broadcast on every police scanner in the tri-state area within the hour." "There's a ferry," Garrett chimed in from the back, "a commercial supply barge that runs scrap and industrial waste from Greenpoint to the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, then drops off supplies at a private dock in Lower Manhattan. The captain owes me a favor. He doesn't ask questions, and he sure as hell doesn't watch CNN." By 5:30 a.m., the Volvo was hidden beneath a massive canvas tarp on the deck of a rusted industrial barge, slowly cutting through the dark, churning waters of the East River. The skyline of Manhattan loomed ahead, a jagged fortress of glass and steel piercing the stormy sky. Arthur stood near the edge of the barge, the freezing wind whipping his jacket. Victoria stepped up beside him. She was still wearing his oversized gray sweatshirt. But the freezing rain had finally stopped. "Once we get the ledgers, what then?" Arthur asked, not looking at her. "I have a contact at the New York Times," Victoria replied. "An investigative journalist who has been trying to expose Conrad for years. If I hand him physical proof of the forged Cayman accounts, the story goes live globally in minutes. The SEC and the FBI will have no choice but to freeze Conrad's assets and issue a federal warrant for his arrest. The kidnapping bounty will be voided. At 6:45 a.m., they abandoned the Volvo in a dark parking garage in the financial district. Garrett stayed behind in the shadows with Chloe, promising to keep her safe while Arthur and Victoria made the final push. The Federal Depository on Fifth Avenue was a fortress disguised as a luxury bank. The exterior was massive, unblemished marble, flanked by towering bronze doors. At exactly 7 a.m., Arthur and Victoria walked through the entrance. They looked entirely out of place. Arthur was in his grease-stained mechanic clothes, and Victoria, though possessing the posture of royalty, was disheveled and wearing borrowed street clothes. A highly polished security guard immediately stepped into their path, his hand resting cautiously on his holstered weapon. "Can I help you?" Victoria didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black metal card bearing a gold insignia. It was her father's private access key. "Vault 804, Victoria said, her voice dripping with the kind of absolute, icy authority that billionaires spend lifetimes perfecting. "And if you attempt to scan my retinas with anything less than a sterilized biometric reader, I will personally see to it that this branch is liquidated by noon." The guard glanced at the black card, his demeanor instantly shifting from suspicious to terrified obedience. "Right away. Ms. Kensington, right this way." Arthur followed her into the heavily armored elevator, his heart pounding against his ribs. They were actually going to pull this off. But as the elevator doors began to close, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored black suit stepped into the lobby. His shaved head gleamed under the chandeliers. It was Desmond, and he wasn't alone. 4 heavily armed men filed in right behind him, their eyes locking directly onto the closing elevator doors. Conrad's fixer had found them. The heavy bronze doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing with a pressurized hiss just a fraction of a second before Desmond's massive hand could wedge between them. Through the rapidly narrowing gap, Arthur caught a final, chilling glimpse of the fixer's dead crew. Emotionless eyes. There was no rage in Desmond's expression, only the cold, calculated certainty of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. The elevator car jerked, beginning its rapid, stomach-dropping descent deep beneath the bedrock of Fifth Avenue. "He saw us," Arthur said, his voice tight. He instinctively reached for his heavy steel wrench, sliding it out of his grease-stained jacket pocket. It was a pathetic weapon against heavily armed mercenaries. But he refused to die empty-handed. "Victoria, they are right behind us. How much time do we have before they override this elevator?" Victoria's hands were shaking, but her jaw was set in rigid determination. She stared up at the digital floor indicator, watching the numbers tick backward into the subterranean levels. "The Federal Depository's security protocols are archaic but impenetrable by design," Victoria explained rapidly, her corporate persona taking the wheel to suppress her rising panic. "To override a VIP elevator during transit, you need the branch manager's physical authorization key. Desmond will have to extract that by force. It will take him at least 3 minutes to secure the lobby, beat the code out of the manager, and initiate the descent. We have exactly 180 seconds to get into Vault 804, secure the ledgers, and find another way out." With a soft chime, the elevator came to a halt at sub-level 4. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, sterile cavern of polished steel and reinforced concrete. The air down here was frigid, humming with the low vibration of massive climate-controlled generators, meant to preserve the priceless artifacts and documents stored within the safety deposit boxes. They sprinted down the echoing corridor, their footsteps slapping frantically against the pristine floor. Row upon row of massive, titanium-reinforced doors lined the walls. "Here!" Victoria gasped, skidding to a halt in front of a heavy door marked with a subtle, engraved 804. Beside the door sat an intricate, Biometric terminal. Victoria shoved the heavy black metal card into the primary slot. A mechanical whirring sounded from deep within the wall. The screen above the slot illuminated, bathing her face in a harsh blue light as a small mechanical arm extended, scanning her right eye with a piercing red laser. "Retinal match confirmed," a synthesized voice announced softly. "Please provide secondary print authorization." Victoria pressed her thumb against the glass pad. For a torturous, agonizing second, the machine simply blinked. Arthur looked back down the long corridor, watching the digital indicator above the main elevator bank. Sub-level 1, sub-level 2. Desmond was coming down. "Come on," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. The heavy titanium bolts inside the door fired backward with a deafening series of mechanical clacks. The vault hissed, the pressure seal breaking, and the heavy door swung outward on its massive, frictionless hinges. They rushed inside. The interior of the vault was surprisingly small, dominated by a single stainless steel table and a row of locked, fireproof lockboxes. Victoria didn't hesitate. She grabbed a small silver key from her necklace, the one piece of jewelry she hadn't surrendered, and jammed it into box A1. She pulled the drawer open. Resting inside was a worn, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowing at the edges. Next to it sat a simple, black, encrypted USB drive. "He kept the paper trail," Victoria breathed, tears welling in her green eyes as her fingers traced the cover of the ledger. "My father knew Conrad was poisoning the company. He gathered the proof. He was trying to protect me." "Victoria, we have to go!" Arthur barked. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the corridor outside. The main elevator had arrived. Arthur grabbed Victoria by the arm, pulling her out of the vault and into the corridor just as Desmond and his 4 mercenaries stepped out of the elevator bay, 50 yards away. The mercenaries were dressed in tactical gear, holding suppressed submachine guns. "Ms. Kensington," Desmond's voice echoed down the steel hallway, eerily calm and amplified by the subterranean acoustics. "Mr. Van Der Berg would like to remind you that your merger is legally binding. Please hand over the documents, and perhaps I will let the mechanic live." "He's lying," Arthur muttered, his mind racing as he scanned the corridor. His mechanical background aggressively analyzed the infrastructure around them. He noticed the red, heavy-duty pipes running along the ceiling, marked with bold yellow warning labels. Halon 1301, fire suppression, danger. "Desmond won't shoot," Victoria whispered back. "If he damages those ledgers, Conrad loses his only leverage. He needs them intact." Arthur didn't wait to test that theory. He looked at the manual override station for the fire suppression system, mounted on the wall, 10 feet away. It was encased in shatterproof glass. "When I say run, you run to the end of the hall and look for a cash transit door," Arthur commanded. Arthur lunged forward. He swung the heavy steel wrench with every ounce of strength he possessed, shattering the reinforced glass of the fire station. He grabbed the heavy red lever and yanked it downward with a violent jerk. Immediately, the corridor was plunged into chaos. The massive claxons on the ceiling began to scream, a deafening, pulsating wail. From the overhead vents, thick, blinding clouds of halon gas aggressively deployed, instantly dropping the oxygen levels in the room and filling the corridor with a dense, impenetrable white fog. "Run!" Arthur roared, grabbing Victoria's hand and sprinting blindly into the fog, away from the elevator and deeper into the labyrinth of the depository. The halon gas was suffocating, burning Arthur's lungs as he blindly dragged Victoria through the thick, white fog. The blaring alarm klaxons completely masked the sound of their footsteps, giving them a desperate, momentary advantage over Desmond's men. Arthur's eyes watered frantically, scanning the concrete walls until he found what he was looking for, A heavy steel door, marked Secure Transit. Armored vehicles only. Arthur slammed his shoulder into the push bar. The door swung open, revealing a steeply angled concrete ramp that led upward toward the surface level. It was the private loading dock used by armored trucks to discreetly transfer physical currency. They scrambled up the ramp, bursting out into the freezing, rain-swept morning air of the loading bay. Parked near the rolling security gate was a massive, idling garbage truck, its hydraulic compactor whining loudly. Arthur didn't hesitate. He pulled Victoria behind the massive steel chassis of the truck, just as the security gate began to roll upward to let the vehicle exit onto the busy Manhattan street. Slipping through the gap alongside the truck, they spilled out onto the bustling pavement of Fifth Avenue. The city was wide awake now. Commuters with umbrellas rushed past, entirely oblivious to the fact that the most wanted man in America, and a billionaire heiress, had just materialized from a subterranean loading dock. "Garrett is waiting at Battery Park," Arthur gasped, leaning against a wet brick wall to catch his breath. "We need to get to him and Chloe, and then we go straight to the New York Times." "We can't take a cab," Victoria said, clutching the leather ledger tightly to her chest beneath the oversized sweatshirt. "The moment we enter a vehicle with a GPS, Conrad will know. We take the subway." For the next 45 minutes, they moved like ghosts through the underground transit system. Arthur kept his head down, using a discarded newspaper he found on a bench to shield his face from the surveillance cameras. The sheer terror of being recognized gnawed at his insides, but the thought of Chloe kept his legs moving. When they finally emerged from the station, near Battery Park, the rain had reduced to a miserable drizzle. The park was mostly empty, the gray waters of the harbor churning angrily in the background, underneath the awning of a closed pretzel stand. Garrett stood like a massive, bearded sentinel. Beside him, sitting on a dry bench and eating a packaged pastry, was Chloe. "Daddy!" Chloe cheered, dropping her pastry and running toward him. Arthur dropped to his knees, catching his daughter in a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her hair, the overwhelming relief momentarily washing away the exhaustion and the fear. "You did good, Artie," Garrett said, handing Arthur a burner phone. "But we have a major problem. I tried to contact your journalist friend. The network is completely jammed. Someone is aggressively monitoring the cell towers in this grid." Victoria's face fell. "Conrad, he knows we made it out of the depository. He's deploying localized signal jammers." Before anyone could react, the screeching of heavy tires ripped through the quiet park. 3 black Mercedes G-Wagons violently jumped the curb, tearing across the wet grass of Battery Park and completely surrounding the pretzel stand. The doors flew open, and a dozen armed mercenaries poured out, immediately forming a perimeter. Desmond stepped out of the lead vehicle, his suit perfectly pressed despite the chaos of the morning. But it wasn't Desmond who commanded the space. From the back of the second SUV stepped Conrad Van Der Berg. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his blonde hair slicked back flawlessly. He looked like the epitome of Wall Street royalty, completely contrasting the violent, thuggish army he commanded. "Victoria, darling," Conrad said, his voice smooth and laced with poisonous condescension. He slowly walked forward, flanked by 2 men holding suppressed rifles. "You have caused quite a scene. Skipping the reception is one thing. But this? You've embarrassed me in front of the board." Arthur instantly shoved Chloe behind him, his body shielding both his daughter and Victoria. Garrett racked his shotgun, leveling it directly at Conrad's chest. "Put the gun down, old man." Conrad sneered, barely glancing at Garrett. "If you pull that trigger, my men will turn this park into a slaughterhouse, and I will make sure the mechanic's charming little daughter is caught in the crossfire." Arthur's heart stopped. The pure, unadulterated evil radiating from Conrad was paralyzing. "Give me the ledger, Victoria," Conrad demanded, holding out a manicured hand. "Hand it over, and I will let the mechanic and his kid walk away. You come with me. We issue a joint statement about a tragic misunderstanding, and the merger proceeds as planned." Victoria stepped out from behind Arthur. She looked at Conrad, the man she had almost married, the man who had threatened to destroy her family's legacy. She looked at the armed men ready to murder an innocent father and child, just to protect a corporate lie. She held the leather ledger up. "You always were a brilliant strategist, Conrad," Victoria said, her voice eerily calm, ringing with absolute authority. "But you made one critical mistake. You assumed my father only left one copy." Conrad's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, black encrypted USB drive she had taken from the vault. "While you were busy jamming the cell towers to stop me from making a phone call, you forgot that my father's vault was wired with a direct, hardline intranet connection to the SEC's secure tip portal," Victoria stated coldly. "A failsafe he installed 5 years ago. I didn't just take the physical ledger, Conrad. I plugged this drive into the vault's terminal before Arthur pulled the fire alarm. The entire digital archive of your forged Cayman accounts, the wire fraud evidence, and the extortion documents were transmitted directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation 10 minutes ago." Conrad's face drained of color, his perfectly maintained facade shattering into absolute panic. "You're bluffing!" Conrad snarled, taking a frantic step forward. Right on cue, the distant, unmistakable wail of a dozen police sirens pierced the air, rapidly approaching Battery Park from all directions. And this time, they weren't NYPD cruisers responding to a kidnapping bounty. The heavy, armored trucks of the FBI's white-collar tactical unit were already barricading the streets. I don't bluff, Conrad," Victoria said, her green eyes flashing with triumph. "I win." The wail of the sirens grew from a distant echo into a deafening, mechanical roar. Through the gray morning mist rolling off the harbor, a fleet of black, heavily armored FBI tactical SUVs smashed through the wrought iron gates of Battery Park. They fanned out with militaristic precision, effectively trapping Conrad's Mercedes G-Wagons in a barricade of reinforced steel. Conrad's eyes darted wildly, the polished veneer of the Wall Street Titan completely disintegrating. He looked at his private army, expecting them to open fire, to protect the man who signed their massive paychecks. Desmond, the cold and calculating fixer, simply looked at the dozens of federal agents pouring out of the tactical vehicles, their laser sights cutting through the drizzle to paint red dots across the chests of the mercenaries. Desmond slowly reached down, unclipped his submachine gun from his tactical harness, and placed it on the wet grass. He raised his hands. "I am on a retainer, Mr. Van Der Berg," Desmond said flatly, his voice devoid of any loyalty. "I handle corporate acquisitions. I do not fight the federal government. You are on your own." Following their leader's silent command, the rest of the mercenaries lowered their weapons, dropping to their knees and lacing their fingers behind their heads. "No!" Conrad shrieked, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic panic. "Shoot them! I'll double your pay! I'll triple it!" It was over, within seconds. Heavily armed federal agents swarmed the park. 2 agents grabbed Conrad, slamming the struggling billionaire against the hood of his own G-Wagon. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoing across the park was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. Victoria stood, perfectly still, watching as the man who had tried to destroy her family was read his rights and shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. The immediate charges would be enough to keep him behind bars for decades. wire fraud and embezzlement, for the illegal offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, extortion, for blackmailing Victoria with forged documents, domestic terrorism and kidnapping, for weaponizing a false bounty and utilizing a private paramilitary force on U.S. soil. An FBI director in a trench coat approached Victoria, but before he could speak, a fleet of black town cars pulled up. Victoria's corporate lawyers, a swarm of the most aggressive, highly paid legal minds in Manhattan, had finally caught up with her. They immediately formed a protective wall around her. Arthur, Chloe, and Garrett. "Ms. Kensington, we have the situation handled," her lead attorney stated, flashing a federal judge's immediate injunction at the FBI agents. "The kidnapping narrative has already been publicly retracted. Mr. Dawson is fully cleared." Arthur felt the immense, crushing weight of the last 12 hours suddenly lift from his shoulders. He dropped the heavy steel wrench onto the pavement, his hands shaking as the adrenaline finally left his system. He pulled Chloe into his arms, burying his face in her small shoulder, tears of pure relief mixing with the rain on his face. Breaking news: billionaire Conrad Van Der Berg arrested by FBI. Kidnapping plot revealed as elaborate corporate cover-up. Mechanic Arthur Dawson cleared of all charges. The next 3 weeks were a blur of federal depositions, aggressive media cycles, and profound readjustment. The news of the runaway billionaire and the hero mechanic captivated the globe. But true to her word, Victoria Kensington ensured that the media never got close to Arthur or his daughter. She deployed her PR firm to aggressively shield their privacy, allowing Arthur to quietly slip back into his normal life in Patchogue. But his life was no longer entirely normal. On a bright Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the chaotic night on Route 27, Arthur was packing a small bag for Chloe's long-overdue dental surgery. A knock at the front door made him pause. When he opened it, Victoria stood on his porch. She wasn't wearing a shredded wedding dress or an oversized, muddy sweatshirt. She wore an immaculate, tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair perfectly styled, radiating the quiet, absolute power of a CEO who had just successfully purged her company's board of directors and cemented her legacy. "Victoria," Arthur said, genuinely surprised. "You shouldn't be here. The press." "The press is currently chasing a decoy motorcade in Manhattan." Victoria smiled warmly, a genuine expression that reached her bright green eyes. "I couldn't just wire the money and never say goodbye." "Arthur," she handed him a thick, sealed manila envelope. "I told you I would compensate you for saving my life," she said softly. "But putting $10 million into a mechanic's bank account would trigger IRS audits and endless federal scrutiny. So, I took a different route." Arthur opened the envelope. Inside was a heavy set of brass keys and a stack of notarized property deeds. "I bought the Southampton garage you work at," Victoria explained. "I fired the owner who makes you work 14-hour shifts, and I transferred the full ownership of the property, the business, and the land to you. It's yours. Arthur, you are your own boss now." Arthur stared at the deeds, completely speechless. "There is also a fully funded trust set up in Chloe's name," Victoria continued, her voice filled with deep gratitude. "Her surgery, her college, her future, it's all taken care of. You never have to worry about the bills again." "Victoria, this is too much," Arthur choked out, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the gift. "You risked everything for a stranger in the middle of a storm." "Arthur," Victoria said, stepping forward to give him a gentle, lingering hug. "You gave me back my life. It's only fair I give you yours." As Victoria's town car pulled away from the modest house in Patchogue, Arthur looked down at the keys in his hand. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a father who had finally secured his daughter's future. The storm had passed, and the morning sun was brighter than ever. What an absolute roller coaster of a story. From a muddy wedding dress on a stormy highway to bringing down a corrupt billionaire empire, Arthur and Victoria proved that true courage can conquer any amount of money and power. This incredible tale shows just how far a parent will go to protect their child, and how the truth always finds a way to the light. If this high-stakes drama kept you hooked until the very last second, make sure to smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. Would you have risked it all to help a stranger on the road? See you in the next story.